What is the most expensive corporate mistake you personally witnessed? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the Vancher channel. Also, please share your thoughts on this video in the comments. Let's get started. Story 1. A secretary misunderstood the CEO and sent an email telling the corporate office that everyone had the entire week of Xmas off without the board, CEO, or CFO signing off. Other branches caught wind and sent out to the entire company. All 4,000 got the week off with pay. Mission Critical did not, but were given the option of comp time or holiday pay. In total, it cost around $5 million. Surprisingly, they took no action against her and have turned it into an annual thing for everyone. Answer: it probably turned into a yearly thing because they saw the results of rewarding your employees. Everyone probably came back refreshed and ready to go at it even harder. Edit: my apologies in advance. My comment was out of ignorance. I do understand that not everyone has a decent job with decent morale and decent leadership, and that is what my comment was meant for. Not for those who are working with terrible conditions and managers who really don't care about their employees. But there are good companies out there. I have worked at those and have many friends who are very happy with their working conditions. Obviously, the company will always look out for its best interests, but they are not always trying to squeeze everything out of all their employees. Story 2. Worked at a place that had a long row of beautiful 150-year-old protected trees. These trees were on a government list for heritage and environmental significance. An exec decided to get about 6 removed without telling anyone to build new infrastructure, millions of dollars worth of fines. He was very, very fired. I'm still broken about those trees. Story 3. I worked for a gasoline storage facility early in my career, where to calibrate one of the more important pumping equipment, we needed to connect the calibration pump directly from one of the storage tanks to another and carefully monitor the flow of gasoline from tank A through the calibration pump and into tank B. It's a really sensitive and time-consuming operation that was only done throughout the night, but strict controls and sign-offs are in place to make sure the exact amount of product leaving one tank is accounted for in the other tank. Gasoline is expensive. Anyway, the technician responsible for monitoring this operation got too tired at how slow everything was going and decided to speed things up a bit by partially opening up one valve around the pipeline, potentially allowing more product to flow out of tank A and into the calibration pump. The only problem is that the product never made it into tank B where it was supposed to go. Turns out the valve that the dude partially opened leads to the drainage system meant for disposing off-spec product. Once anything gets into this drainage line, we have no control of it as it ends up into the waste collection tank that we don't have custody over. The aftermath: 300,000 liters, about 80,000 gallons of gasoline were diverted into the waste collection tanks. A few people lost their jobs that week. Edit: it was not a mistake. The guy was experienced enough to know what we has doing. There was an internal process in place that this particular valve was normally locked closed. The only person on shift that had access to its key was that guy. His mistake was severely underestimating how much gasoline would drain away. He thought it would be a fraction of the loss, and he would be able to bullshit away the loss due to an equipment failure or something. Edit 2. This didn't happen in the U.S. It happened in a place where the fuels market is heavily subsidized and controlled by the government. A loss at this scale is a big deal, akin to theft as far as the government is concerned, hence the firings. Answer: worked at a dairy back in the 90s in the refrigerator vaults, pulling product off the conveyor belts to store them before they were loaded on trucks, shipped off to grocery stores. We bottled milk, OJ, and fruit juice in a variety of containers. One particular morning, we had one manufacturing line putting milk in plastic gallon jugs and another line that was running 12-gallon cartons of OJ. Similar to above, one of the engineers got confused and turned the wrong valve. It was interesting seeing mixed gallon jugs of milk, OJ, coming down the conveyor line until they shut everything down. It took 3 hours to get the pipes tanks emptied, cleaned, then ready to rerun. There were 20 of us that sat around while that was happening, then got the corresponding overtime to get caught up as a result. In case anyone was wondering, the milk OJ mix wasn't dumped. We sold it at a steep discount to pig farmers to use as feed slop. We also regularly sold them expired products as well. Apparently, the pigs loved it. Story 4. A previous CIO decided that we were done with vendor A and would move to vendor B without telling vendor A. I pointed out that we probably shouldn't do that because The contract was auto-renewing, and we needed to give them termination notice. So that happened, and Vendor A sued for 3 years of their service fees. They only got 1 year's worth of damages, $600,000. Same org had a big legal case where the government was suing us. There was a physical server on litigation hold. I suggested that we should probably create a backup, but was told it was too risky to touch. Well, sure enough, when discovery happened, we couldn't find the server that legal had possession of for chain of custody. Default judgment over 10M. Story 5. Came in to work one morning and a server wasn't accessible. I did some basic troubleshooting, then sent a message to our IT team. They started looking into it, and from messages I saw over the next 30 minutes, it went from just restart it to why isn't it turning on to we got bad news. A hard drive in the RAID array failed, resulting in the loss of 1 week's worth of scanned and microfilm. It put one of our production lines down for over a month. I don't know the technical details why. Then I noticed one of the IT guys left the company. As it turns out, during the post-mortem trying to figure out why the drive failed without warning, they asked the IT guy about the automated warnings when the drives start to have issues. His response? Oh, those? They had been going on for a month, but everything was working fine, so I turned off the warnings. I'm not sure what the financial damage was, but I know the server fix was expensive, and we had to shuffle every project, extend deadlines, and higher-ups dealt with a lot of unhappy clients. Answer: a hard drive in the RAID array failed, resulting in the loss of 1 week's worth of scanned and microfilm. It put one of our production lines down for over a month. I don't know the technical details why. A hard drive failing in a RAID array should not have that effect. Unless it's RAID 0, which is something that should only theoretically exist, nobody should ever actually use it. RAID 10, maybe. 2 hard drives failing, though, that can definitely be, and usually is, an oh shoot. Story 6. Guy was automating a process to delete old data, so stuff would automatically get purged when it was 2 years old. Accidentally applied it to an extra category of data we had intended to keep, deleted 9 years of historical customer data. A bunch of it was unrecoverable because, in rough terms, it wasn't a category of data with off-site backups, and his automation purged the on-site ones. He was not fired. Story 7. So where I work is about an hour away from home. Most people in office commute in as well. One year there was a nasty snowstorm, and local authorities were advising motorists to stay off the roads, as was the weather service. Long story short, a coworker called in and said they weren't going to risk it. Boss went off saying it's their fault they live so far away. He attempts to come in, gets into an accident after sliding off the road and into a ditch, rolls the car, and breaks his arm. Company got sued into oblivion for negligence. He won, surprisingly. Company still hasn't changed their policy on this, even for the once or twice a winter it might happen where we shouldn't make it in. Cost them over $2 million. Answer: one of the best days of my life was when I had a boss tell me, regardless of the incoming storm, he expected me to be at the front office at 7 a.m. as normal. He would work from home. And I replied back that I was at an age and station in life where I wouldn't be doing that anymore. No threats, no arguments back and forth. I simply said, I am in a position in my career where I will not be risking my health or safety for that reason. Thanks, and that was it. He was more than welcome to shit-can me for that, but what I said was true. I was very much at a point where I could have gotten a comparable job somewhere else pretty quickly, and I did a year or two later anyway. Flipping to the other side of the corporate, you need me more than I need you, gives you incredible leverage to just not put up with dehumanizing bullshit. Story 8. I worked for a university that, as a cost-saving measure, let go 50 senior staff members administrators who each had 25 years of experience with data systems, admissions, policies, etc. They marched them all out on the same day as if they had been caught embezzling. They soon realized they no longer had anyone left who knew how the just functions of the university worked day to day and had to rehire many of them as consultants at a higher cost than they had been paying before. Answer: I worked at a public district that did the same thing, but no union for administrators. The board voted to can almost everybody from assistant principals to the superintendent on the advice of a newly hired CFO, using the global pandemic as an excuse to make drastic cost-cutting measures. She would take advantage of the bureaucratic molasses that slowed even more during the pandemic, and it was almost 2 years before anybody discovered discrepancies in finances, or at least 2 years for our complaints to catch the attention of county and state government. To add to the case, the cheaper administrator replacements were all green, learning a new school system during the pandemic. The school year was a disaster, and the new superintendent was fired. An even newer Supe showed up and raised alarms about missing funds. After a private disciplinary board meeting, the CFO resigned with the rest of her annual salary. The newest superintendent also resigned, and a public statement went out blaming him for the missing funds that he informed the board about, and a mold issue that was mismanaged 2 superintendents prior. But the public was still outraged and didn't accept this scapegoat. Students organized and picketed in front of the homes of the board members. Families wrote to major newspapers and local news outlets. Eventually, almost all the board members lost their seats, but the damage was already done. Not just financially, but in terms of quality staff who were fired or quit among the chaos. And most importantly, the negative impact on the students who lost access to resources and good educators, in addition to the regular learning loss of the pandemic. We're still untangling the mess, all because of one person's greed and a group of morons who applied cold business principles to an educational ecosystem that relies heavily on the wellness of people. Story 9. I once worked at an e-commerce company that you've heard of. At one point, they needed a new on-site search engine, and in the build versus buy discussion, they decided to buy a product for $1 million. Once we started to implement it, we quickly realized that the search product did not support faceting. Faceting is what allows e-commerce to work. If you have a group of 100 products, faceting creates the sidebar categories you can filter by like men's, women's, t-shirts, pants, hats, etc., with a count of each available to display. So this was never going to work for us. The search vendor's contract was ironclad, and basically the company just ate the $1 million as a loss. The architect who made this boneheaded decision seemingly suffered no consequences, which was quite the trend for his career there. To this day, I maintain that he must have had blackmail materials, raunchy texts or private pictures or something, on the CTO because anyone else would have been fired for such a screw-up. Answer: I also once worked at an e-commerce site that you've heard of. At the time, product data was submitted by sellers through spreadsheets and copy-pasted from those spreadsheets into other tools that then populated the website. On more than one occasion, a 99.99 listing was accidentally sold at 9.99 due to bad copy-pasting. Automated systems run by customers were built to capitalize on this before we had our own systems to flag and disable those listings. So in a matter of minutes, you could sell through thousands of items of inventory when customers noticed. Due to the nature of the specific inventory being digital at the time, there was no effective clawback method. Over my tenure, we probably lost close to $500,000. Similarly, the data that told us how much to pay sellers for each sale was manually entered. I personally fat-fingered a critical entry for a very large vendor right before a massive sale of theirs. This resulted in them being paid roughly 10 of what they were actually owed. The end result was that when the New Year's budget rolled over, they noticed 10 million missing. We had 10 million surplus, wanted it immediately, and when the correction was made, a huge chunk of people that were just hired in lieu of the extra budget had to be let go. Story 10. I used to work for a logistics company, and a few shipping containers of frozen shrimp and lobster tails came into a port on the West Coast. Each shipping container is about the size of a trailer for a semi-truck. It was supposed to ship via rail to somewhere in the Midwest. Remember that this was in the summer. Since it was frozen and needed to remain frozen until its arrival several days later, it was required to be loaded and shipped with a reefer unit, basically a larger refrigerator or freezer unit to keep it cold and or frozen, to keep it frozen during that trip. Someone on our team did not check the box to request a reefer on the train to keep it frozen. When it arrived several days later across the country, it had thawed and rotted. My understanding was that it was north of $1 million we lost on that one. Answer: one of my wife's extended family owns a shipping company in Hong Kong, so despite me knowing next to nothing about the containers used for this sort of stuff, they asked me to travel to Florida once, from my home in Michigan, to inspect some refurbished, refrigerated shipping containers which they had purchased. Apparently, there's a lot of fraud in that industry when people purchase such containers, have them inspected to verify they're working as claimed, then have them shipped to Asia only to find out that they were switched after the initial inspection. I was asked to inspect the containers as they were being loaded onto the ship, which would carry them to Hong Kong. All I had to do was confirm that the numbers on the containers being loaded matched the numbers that were previously certified. Apparently, fraud is so common that it was worth their money to buy me a plane ticket to Florida, pay for a hotel room and a rental car for me for 3 days, and pay me $500 a day for my time. That said, I disliked Florida in August. It was like breathing underwater from the humidity. Story 11. At a large post-secondary educational institution, the payroll department was understaffed and one of the payroll clerks stayed late to run an off-cycle pay run. This not the normal full payroll, but only goes to a handful of people who need corrections or adjustments to their regular pay. Accidentally, she ran the full payroll a second time, meaning thousands of employees got their full paycheck twice, and so an extra $25 million went out the door. Management had to scramble the next day to get the banks to pull back all the money and sent an email out telling everyone not to withdraw the money from their accounts as it was an error. Management was going to discipline the clerk who made the mistake. But the union pointed out it was a stupid system where some low-level clerk making $40K a year can press the wrong button and $25 million goes out the door with no second level of confirmation. So the discipline was withdrawn and they made changes to the system. Answer, we had this with a finance company I worked for. Dude fat-fingered an asset sale and tried to send $3 billion instead of $300 million to account. Banks froze the entire client account when they saw the order as they realized there was no possible way it was real. 24 hours, no money moved. The guy came TK the disciplinary with a report on how fudge stupid it was that he could do that and what to implement to ensure it didn't happen again, and they promoted him. Story 12. The president of the grocery store chain I used to work for was given first crack at a location in a thriving shopping center next to a Target. Instead, she chose to build at a location across a 4-lane road that divided 2 towns. She chose the location because the town on that side was a more affluent town. The location she chose closed within 5 years. The original location went to Wegmans, which is always mobbed. 2 years later, she chose to move the location of another store to a richer part of another town. The new location closed after 3 years. The old location sold to a developer who built a ShopRite. The ShopRite is always busy. She resigned after that kerfuffle. Story 13. I worked at a company that held a government contract. Every 5 years, the contract would be open for bidding, and corporate would have to submit a new bid and negotiate any details they didn't like. About 10 years ago, they suddenly got worried that someone else would undercut us and win, so they slashed their bid by a ton. We're talking millions of dollars off our bid price just to counter the fear that some unknown party might offer to do the job for slightly less money. They won the contract, but they had cut their own bids so low that they were barely turning a profit. How do you fix that? Simply pay for everyone working that contract and kick everyone off normal 8-hour shifts to work 12s instead. The team turned into a revolving door of new people coming and going. The morons in charge of running the team started hiring people missing some of the basic qualifications, thinking they could hire them cheap, then train them. The underqualified hires would stick around for a year or two, getting a bigger paycheck than they were used to, and then bounce with a more competitive resume than they came in with. Story 14. I've seen this pattern more than once. A U.S. company gets sold on lower-cost software development and offshores most of its dev work, China, India, etc. I'm not saying that decision caused the outcome, but in my experience, every company that went all in on that move was out of business within 3 years. Answer, a place I worked at replaced a bunch of devs with some overseas devs. I knew a couple of them and they were pissed. They were told over months that the offshore team was a new dev team brought on to handle extra workloads and then laid off our devs. A couple months later, I saw 2 of the devs back in the office. Apparently, the new hires were so bad and slow, the company reached out to former devs. I do know 2 of my friends named their salary, and they were accepted back without question. Story 15. Worked it for a bit goods company almost 20 years ago. I was the lowly guy on the totem pole, so I got Thanksgiving on call in office. Literally the only person in the building. 0702, I get a call. Hey, this one service is down. Please fix. I have never heard of this service, so I look at our in-house KB. Of course, it's not documented. I call the listed on-call guy for this service. No answer. I call the second guy. No answer. I get a second call. Hey, it's still down. It's been 20 minutes. This is a major issue. Fix now. I call my supervisor. He has a small heart attack when I name the service. Tells me to call on-call guy every 10 minutes. Call him every 30 minutes if I am not on the phone with on-call. Guy and email everyone from the CEO on down every hour with every single thing I tried in the hour to get this fixed. 3 hours into this, he calls me and gives me a number. It's the lady who used to do the support for this service. Retired 2 years ago, he got a blanket approval to get her to do the support at any cost. Call her every 10 minutes until she picks up and get her going. I spend 2 more hours calling and getting this lady set up to do her work, as she, of course, did not have a company laptop and lived 2 states away now. And this was long before the age of easy VPNs on every machine. Had to set her up with a log me in to a company machine for her to work. I clocked out at 1800 that day, having cycled through 3 headsets as batteries died. The next day, my boss, his boss, and the head of on-site sat me down to tell me good job for following procedure and doing everything as per spec. There would be very angry people, however, for a while, because, as it turns out, that service was the billing system for what we output. That means that the company lost 0.5 every hour that it was down. All in all, the system was down for 23 hours and lost the company 11 that day. Turns out the on-call guy really wanted a quiet Thanksgiving, so he didn't take his phone with him when he went to his BIL's house and didn't check it when he got home. I did not get fired, and I believe neither did he. But for my first year of deep IT, it made every other problem since being sharp perspective. Story 16. Emma claims adjuster. My manager settled a claim for 1M. Somehow he issued the check for 10M. Luckily, his manager caught it and stopped paid the check. But it had already been mailed out. It turned into a big, expensive legal issue. Answer. Seems pretty straightforward. If you're issued the incorrect amount and you knowingly try to cash it, then you're liable for the rest. Something as if your employer paid you incorrectly. Hard to believe it went anything past a call to the claimant, and we will be issuing a new check. At my company, we have like 4 people sign off on any amount over 100K. So the fact that 9,000 wasn't noticed is insane. Story 17. Happened this year. Working for an IT firm, management wanted to roll out a time entry solution that automatically tracked the status of projects. So they found a solution, imported all of our data from our old ticketing system, trained all the techs, pilot group, etc. Then they found out we would need a full license for anyone that wanted to view data. There was no read-only license option, easily quadrupled the cost estimate. They abandoned the solution a month before go-live. Story 18. I worked on the UK's Post Office Horizon project. I was a contract system tester, working on the front end of the system. As part of my tests, I had to load products into my model post office, as a postmaster would do it, and then sell those products at multiple counters. I decided to do some testing over multiple days, which involved running the overnight reconciliation process. And in doing this, I noticed that the figures on the reconciliation often simply didn't add up, so I raised a ticket. A couple of days later, the ticket was closed with no update, and when I asked about it, I was told it wasn't my job to test this, and that another team was looking at it. A few months later, however, and obviously a lot closer to the release date, I noticed that it still wasn't working, so I raised another ticket for the same issue. This time I was told quite forcefully to stay in my lane, and the ticket was closed. Shortly afterwards, all the contract workers were let go in order to meet budget deadlines, which meant about 80 of the testing staff and 60 of coders walked out the door, along with all their knowledge. The system was released, and the rest is history. It's already cost over $1 billion just in compensation for victims. Story 19. I worked for Bed Bath & Beyond right at the end, in a unique position that straddled store level and corporate national, working directly for some of the founding family's members. Because of this, I had an equally unique front row seat to its self-inflicted passing spiral. I literally don't have the energy to type out all of their missteps, maybe another time, but the final nail in the coffin was when Triton basically just went ahead and fired anyone who made more than 16 her or so. Overnight, the company lost legacy employees who'd been with the company 10 to 20 years or more, essentially their entire knowledge base. Well, it turned out that one of the main reasons people shopped at BBB, especially ours, which was one of their original flagships in operation since the company opened, was its veteran employees with their years of expert experience on products. Customers noticed the loss and business dropped instantly. Without that knowledge base, There was nothing to incentivize people to pay the higher price over MMS and or even shop in the store at all. There's so much more I could get into, but I just don't have the energy ATM. Don't let anyone tell you COVID or the internet eliminate BBB. It was completely self-inflicted. Answer. Well, it turned out that one of the main reasons people shopped at BBB, especially ours, which was one of their original flagships in operation since the company opened, was its veteran employees with their years of expert experience on products. I spent many hours and dollars shopping at BBB long before their demise. I don't believe this statement for 1 minute. Story 20. Back when BlackBerry was printing money, I saw an exec throw a tantrum over a team-specific customization to a piece of commercial software. Despite multiple efforts by the business analysts to show workaround and alternatives, he was having none of it. Fast forward 6 EMOs, customization has been built and integrated into multiple supporting workflows. Exec sees why it is inefficient and states remove it. Now the discussion of how it will cost 3x the effort money to back it out begins, to which he replies, I don't care. Story 21. The CEO of the company I worked for got his fees hurt because the Fortune 5 company that we'd had our biggest contract with for over 20 years was putting us through a pretty rigorous RFP process at contract renewal. They'd had a new head of procurement come in when my CEO's old buddy retired, and the new guy wasn't going to rubber stamp us like had been done every time previous. This new guy was going over our response with a fine-toothed comb and hitting our side with pointed questions, and my CEO lost it and went on a rant about the depth of the relationship. And you might be new, but that's not how this has gone, and we've always done right by you, and blah, blah, blah. The new guy sat there like a stone and then just repeated his previous question. The people on his side were staring at their counterparts on our side with eyes like dinner planes. And the people on our side, some of them literally had their heads in their hands. Worth noting that the people on our side had been working on the RFP response for the past month and a half under the assumption that it would not be a rubber stamp because, fudge, it's our biggest goddamn contract, so of course you treat it that way. We had the answers, and it didn't hurt our fees to be asked the questions. Needless to say, we lost the contract. 30 of our revenue walked out the door about a month later, approximately $30 million annually. And about 3 months after that, half the company, me included, was laid off. The most annoying part about this whole thing to me, other than the layoff, was the hypocrisy. This guy spent the entirety of COVID almost showing off with how little of a shoot he gave about people's feelings of fear and anxiety. He literally banned masks from company functions. Full-on stunting as this hyper-masculine, don't tread on me, stoic wannabe tough guy, then throws away half of everything he's ever built over a little ego tantrum. What a weak jerk. Answer. This reminded me of a company I worked for that had a large contract with an international burger chain. I'd just been put on the account because it was mismanaged for over a year and about to churn. Tried to save it, but too little too late. My CEO wrote an immature and downright nasty email that he planned to send to the president of the burger chain and asked me to look over it before he hit send. I was horrified and asked him directly, "What do you hope to accomplish with this?" And his response was, "To make this guy feel like crap and be angry." And in that moment, I knew my equity shares in the company would never amount to anything significant. Story 22. This situation is from back in the early 2000s. I worked in a large IT department for county government. A colleague, a woman, was working on integrating a new records handling system for our legal department. That project included several county workers plus vendor reps who were working with us in-house and living in our city during the work week. It was a project predicted to last a year or more. My colleague's part in all this was creating and testing new reports. At one point, she repeatedly raised a red flag that the new system only seemed to be accounting for criminal cases, but not civil cases. The project leader kept telling her to mind her own business. They treated her badly after that and resorted to explicitly excluding her from project team meetings. One day, I noticed there were people literally running back and forth in our department. A bit later, I got a call from my colleague who was still home at the time. She asked if I was seeing anything unusual, and I said yes. She then explained she was told to stay home, the project was on hold, the vendor was fired, and they were desperately seeking bids for a new vendor to pick up the pieces and move forward. What triggered this? Coincidentally, the county had recently hired a new database analyst, a man, who was not assigned to that special project, but his manager asked him to review the database table structures. It did not take him long to see the red flags my colleague had noticed months before. It hit the fan. A new vendor would be hired, the old vendor was going to be sued, and the project would move forward again. I had a cordial relationship with my department head because we both often worked late after most employees had gone home. So one evening, after the dust had settled, I ambled into his office to explain why I felt my colleague deserved an apology. I went so far as to observe that a woman raised these flags long before and was ignored, but a man was instantly believed and able to trigger an investigation. A few days later, my department head had verified my statements. He personally met with my colleague to apologize for how she had been treated. Story 23. I was working on a commissioning project for a gas plant, and the company I worked for was trying to beat the end-of-the-year deadline for tax purposes. They overworked our brand new systems and equipment, causing a major casualty. The couple million they saved in taxes was replaced by tens of millions in investigating the accident, lost revenue from the plant not running, etc. I knew they were pushing the systems beyond their limits, reported the lack of safety measures and concerns for my own safety. 1 week later, the casualty happened. Dumbest, unavoidable money loss I've witnessed. Story 24. The company I worked for was purchased for something like $30 million. The buyer specifically wanted the product that my office handled. It was the key to a strategic plan they had for their future. Right after buying the company, they showed up with this whole song and dance about expansion and how the product was super important. 30 days later, they were back talking about how cuts will be done with unnecessary parts of the company not related to the product we worked on. But as they spoke, I picked up on things that made me realize they were prepping us to be fired, while simultaneously saying the group involved with our product was critical and would be expanded. I realized they confused which location was involved with the product they wanted and were planning to shut down the wrong location. I warned people and tried to get the word out, but everyone said I was wrong. A week later, they were back again to fire all of us and close our location. During my exit interview, I pointed out to the president of the company that bought us that they were closing the wrong office, and he had a shocked, "Oh, shoot" look when I told him. Needless to say, the location they kept open had a product they didn't need or want and lacked the skills to take over our product. 6 months later, our product had been discontinued entirely. A year later, their entire project was in shambles, and their future plans that needed our product had been scrapped. They pissed away $30 million and derailed a strategic long-term plan of the company because someone fudged up and mixed up which locations handled which products. Story 25. Way back in the early 90s, an engineer at Apple decided to embed a pic of himself outside his office as a hidden resource in the OS. The software it was embedded in was a hardware enabler for the latest flagship computer, early power PC system, codenamed Flagship. A system update engineer noticed the image, opened it, saw that the engineer included a poster of Paula Abdul in the background, and then asked his manager if that was a copyright issue. The manager decided to ask the legal depth. They contacted Abdul's management agency, and they wanted royalties, of course. The expensive part is that these machines were already imaged and stacked in a warehouse awaiting shipment. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of inventory. All had to be pulled, boxes opened, hard drives re-imaged. Surprisingly, they didn't fire the engineer. They transferred him to a manager he disliked, and he resigned shortly afterwards. I still have the CD that contains the offending image. Somewhere around here. Story 26. Not the most expensive, maybe, but the funniest. I used to work as a retail banker for Wells Fargo. On more than one occasion, someone has hit reply all to an email, intending to reply to all of the other employees in their small department. What they actually did was reply all to the entire company, locking up email for most of the day. To make matters worse, people in unrelated departments then started to reply all to the entire company as well, sending emails titled, "Please stop replying to all." Answer. That happened once, about 10, 11 years ago, Army-wide. I don't know how the chain started, but a bunch of us got added to the email chain, and thousands of people were hitting reply all to things asking to be taken off the thread, essentially making it worse. I was in Georgia writing emails from people in Germany, Washington State, Kansas. It was hilarious. Story 27. I worked for a company that fired their best salesman. Dude landed a contract for us that was in the tens of millions, bigger than anything we'd ever done before by an order of magnitude. We had to go on a hiring spree to facilitate the size of it. We made serious bank. Corporate drummed up a bullshit reason to fire him to get out of paying their percentage of the sale to the guy. Big time bullshit, just to make the current quarter look a little better. About a year later, we went underwater and the layoffs started. I got canned too, eventually. Company never died completely, but never did come back to their previous standing. I mean, of all the stupid things to do, hey, I know what? Let's fire our best people. That'll save some serious money. If I had a salesman like this guy working for me, I'd do just about anything to keep him. A guy that can find multi-million-dollar contracts? Yes, please. But nope. They let him go, screwed him out of his percentage, and down the tubes the whole thing went. Can't say I'm sorry. Story 28. Going off memory here, for this happened 15 years ago. I used to work for a bank that was big in the Southeast USA. They have many AML systems. I run one of them. They decide wisely to consolidate the AML systems into one system. On the surface, this makes sense. They go with a vendor and decide to only buy the engine and not the GUI. This is important, for they didn't want to pay for 38,000 seat licenses. Their logic was they could pass data using the API to the engine. The mistake was they didn't take the time to see how the API engine worked. It was very limited on the types of data it could pass to the engine. The engine did all the calculating to give a risk rating. The API could only process input that was Boolean, short text, number, and paragraph. It could not do multi-pick. Because of this limitation, when you do an AML assessment, you could not ask a question like, what country do you do business in? This fudge-up caused the project to go over budget by millions. When I left the bank, they had dumped $85 million, and it still didn't work. They created a special position for me early on and asked me to fix this problem. I looked at the problem and told them, you can't fix this. The system has to be able to ask a multi-pick question. You can't go to the person doing the assessment and ask them to enter in with yes-no responses 185 times if they did business in a country or not. They went to the company that owned the software and asked them how to deal with this problem. I shoot you not. The response was, ask the question in a different way. You can't. I think they ended up building an in-house system in parallel that would do all the question stuff, do an AML risk calculation, and then have it spit out the answers that the API could pass to the vendor's engine. The ironic thing was I had, with my team, already built a solution that they could have used, easily. The project manager said he didn't want to pay for the licensing. He thought it needed 38,000 licenses. I told him no, it only needed one license. He said I was wrong. Understand, it was already running like that. All he needed to do was look at the paperwork. I swear you can't make up this level of stupid. Story 29. My father had a good friend who owned a large construction company. They had a failure so big there's a Wikipedia article on it. Workers left covers open overnight and bad things happened. Answer, then there was that letter to the editor of the Seattle Times from an acquaintance of mine. He said the company working on the bridge should have called upon someone from his profession. He wrote about his work on bridges and canals, some of them deep and twisting. He mentioned the importance of keeping water out of the cement. Said a few other things I don't recall, but seemed like good advice in context. Then at the bottom, alongside his name, he said what his profession was. He was a dentist. Story 30. Many moons ago, I started in a career in IT. Freshly out of night school, clutching my CCNA. Worked for a one-man company, I was employee NO2, who got involved in setting up an automation process in a factory. Each part now had to be scanned at each station so they could monitor production and increase efficiency. Lots of investment. However, the final station was at the warehouse door to scan the finished product out the door onto the buyer, and then accounts can invoice it. They could never get this terminal to work, and it made the whole system useless. It was also temperamental in the extreme. Waste of money, costing us production time, costing us money, etc., etc., etc. Enter fresh-faced me. My dad was a sound electrical engineer, important later, and after an afternoon of me being ignored while the adults in the room fixed the issue, I decided to trust my instincts. Dad always said, check the basics, so off I went round the factory just looking at the setup. I was at the warehouse door in the final problematic station I was checking if it was plugged in. Noticed the Ethernet cable snaking out the back and decided to follow it. Lo and behold, the cable ran across the factory before coiling up, for no apparent reason, in a small area next to the main power supply for the factory, like a small substation. Bingo, found the smoking gun, but I knew I had a fight on my hands. Went back to the meeting room and eventually interrupted. I think I know what the issue is. Doubt it. But we are all out of ideas, so shoot cue teenage me, explaining to a room of adult men with many, many IT letters after their name, what happens when you coil cable around a massive electrical source. All that expertise and none of them paid attention to high school science. Also turns out that all those weird things my old man taught me about microphones and loudspeakers came in handy. Essentially, you've made a huge electrical magnet out of the Ethernet cable, and the electrical interference will be dropping packets. Doesn't this explain it? Silence and head thumps. Lots of swearing. 6 weeks after install and lots of dosh later, the kid was right. Electrician got the blame, and my boss always listened to me when I had a hunch. Story 31. Reg employee decided to move files around and deleted every customer we had on the server. Somehow he is still employed. Story 32. Boeing merger with McDonnell Douglas. When they brought over the executives that ran McDonnell Douglas into the ground and put them in charge. Story 33. My old company spent 6 figures developing a new logo. The final presentation was just the old logo, but in Comic Sans. The CEO loved it. Story 34. My favorite, our network team in Prague ordered hardware for our new data center and upgrades for older gear in America, where I am. Once they got here, I found the issue. Every fan was the wrong flow type and had to be replaced. The cables and racks didn't allow me to just flip the devices. $1 million to replace every fan and power supply across all our environment because no one verified port intake or port exhaust on an order form. Story 35. An engineer at a data center got tired of the server sitting on the floor for months, so he sent it to the shredder. The server in question was $1 million+ checkpoint firewall. Story 36. I don't work at this company anymore, but this one still stands out. About 9 years ago, the new head of facilities asked my boss if the new boardroom would have Wi-Fi. Boss replied yes. Facilities guy ordered an expensive bog oak table. The owner of the company wanted it, without have any holes cut to hide cables for the VC equipment. He thought Wi-Fi meant no need for cables. The boardroom table was bespoke, designed and built to order, and had to basically be rebuilt. He didn't last long after that. Story 37. This one is for my IT friends. I worked in an accounting firm that hired a new operations expert as a manger. She had a brilliant idea to restore DLT tapes in full to an alternate file share location so that they could later be backed up to LTO instead to consolidate. Now I, sister sysadmin, heavily advised against this, thinking we should just store them as is and let the retention cycle organically allow us to destroy them in the future. It just seemed like worthless busy work to me. Well, anyway, she commanded our junior backup admin to follow orders, showed him how to do it step by step. Well, the junior admin did exactly as he was told. Started a restore of the entire backup, set the alternative UNC path, and went home. We came in the next morning to find our entire Exchange server and SQL Server databases overwritten from a year ago. She forgot to consider the fact there is more than just file share data on the backups. In the end, the junior admin was reprimanded. Needless to say, we both left that company shortly after, and so did she for unknown reasons. That incident cost the company millions, and ultimately they ended up getting bought out by a larger accounting firm. Story 38. Hired 25 people with master's degrees in computer science, but zero experience to update an undocumented program that was 20 years old in a language none of them had ever seen. They created fictional completion dates for 6 months before it collapsed, and they were all fired. Story 39. I've seen at least 3 really expensive mistakes. Maybe the most expensive eliminate the company. Over $6 billion of value wiped out. It was a hot, new, fabulous semiconductor startup. The first generation of products did okay, but the company really needed the second generation. First generation was manufactured by one of the most reputable in the world at the time. They were, however, a bit expensive and not very flexible. So the new CEO decided that the second generation product would be fabricated elsewhere. This fabricator was very good, but they had never ever created their own fabrication process. They had always used a couple of industry leaders to develop any new process for them. Semiconductor fab processes are very complex and difficult to get right, so this had worked well for them. So of course, we were going to be the very first customer on their brand new internally developed process to make a product that our company had to have to survive. You can probably guess where this is going. The new process had a huge flaw. By the time that it was discovered, analyzed, and fixed, over 9 months had passed. Our customers all lost patience and went elsewhere or canceled their products. They had created new products based on ours, and they were effectively screwed when we couldn't deliver. This wasn't the only big mistake my company made, but it was the final straw. We managed to drag out our demise for a few years. We went from being the hottest startup in Silicon Valley to whatever happened to them. Story 40. Wachovia Bank bought Golden West Financial in 2006 at the zenith of the CMO craze. They were eliminated with the pick-a-pay concept for around $25 billion. 2 years later, zip, nada, just poof. I still have PTSD from 2008. Anytime you see something in financial services that looks cutesy, fluffy, and easy to remember, look more closely. Story 41. An AR person approved an order of $500,000 worth of laptops to be sent to a brand new customer. Laptops weren't something we typically sold. The customer was brand new and had no DNB record. It basically failed every single contract review point, but the salesperson was desperate to make the sale, so she approved it. Unsurprisingly, it was fraud and the laptops disappeared and were never paid. I guess people fudge up, and that would have been a learning opportunity if she hadn't done it again a month later. Answer: I work in chemical distribution. We have a bunch of customers on payment before delivery terms. Every few months, one of these customers calls every sales rep from our company in their area looking for product. Even if we take the PO, our internal system, SAP, won't release it, and we'll put it on credit hold until we receive payment, which we won't. Every so often, you see that another company takes the sale and then gets burned on trying to get paid. Story 42. 25 years ago, and not so much money-wise, though, there were fines. I worked for an agency that had to follow strict regulations when it came to paperwork. Basically, people filed a document at one place, which was then forwarded to us for our part of the process. There were about a dozen types that were immediately logged and copied. One copy went into the keep forever. Never destroy file room by log. One copy went into a file by month. The other into a file by paper type. Also in date order. Yes, it was tedious, but it made it so. If we were asked, you could just grab whatever was needed. I hope by now the system is updated, but shrug, not my job anymore. Then the original was researched, a report made and copied to go with all our copies, then returned to the other department. I went out on emergency sick leave, and a coworker who wanted my easy job volunteered to fill in for the 3 months I ended up being out. Within the first week, she convinced the supervisors that I had no idea what I was doing. They had a meeting with multiple levels of superiority who should have known why the procedures existed and decided to follow her suggestions. First thing was to hire a shredding company to completely empty the files. Then streamline the paperwork process. They came in, she did the research and report needed and sent them back. No log, no copies, nothing. I came in for a meeting at the end of my leave and nearly had a panic attack. They completely dismissed my concerns and transferred me. 2 days later, someone came looking for paperwork, then another. Then there was an audit and chute exploded. No copies of the old stuff, which was needed often. No copies of the new stuff, which was needed constantly. The auditors pulled me in and I told them what happened. Then the big bosses. Then a meeting with everyone, including my replacement, who tried to blame me while crying. They were going to fire her immediately, but I said no. Someone had to go to the other department, down into their storage and copy every single document and report, then refile it with us. Wasn't going to be me. I can still see the smirk on biggest boss's face. She was demoted to the lowest paid level and told to replicate our files. She also was in charge of finding any document anyone needed, and that other department's files were basically fill a box, put in storage, no order, no system. I was surprised, but she completed the work, and yes, it took forever. Before she quit, every supervisor that agreed to the change was demoted and ordered to help carry boxes every day as they were filled. I got my job back with a raise to cover what I was going to have to reorganize because, no, darling, you aren't setting up the filing system. You put stuff where I tell you and had my jerk kissed for months. I was still limping around, so I got my own copier, And if I even glanced at the snack or drink machine, someone came running. Story 43. I worked at Al Gore's Current TV from 2001 to the end of 2007. I watched them move from startup to buzzword to almost kind of being a thing to eventually firing everyone and selling their assets to Al Jazeera America. The other executives were a law firm founder and an executive from NBC. They had big plans and basically ran it into the ground like a web company. Story 44. I used to support restaurant POS systems. Way too many sites refused to spend $800 on a simple firewall. Too many got hacked and couldn't afford to stay in business after all the fines. Surprisingly, one site also had an unsecured Wi-Fi in the same subnet as their POS system. If you knew how to use File Explorer, you could get their employee database. Oddly, they didn't get hacked. But from what I heard, the health department shut them down. Story 45. I'm in advertising. My firm specialized in really high-end print work with high production values. Years ago, a printer was trying to win our business. They did a lot of top-notch stuff, so I was interested. He was walking me around the floor of the plant, showing off the Mergenthalers in operation, the finishing rooms, etc. There was a pallet with finished covers of brochure waiting to be stitched onto the insides. He picked up the cover and handed it to me. Really nice piece for a big construction company. 120 Osmami cover stock, immaculate photography, you name it. This is an example of what we do, a $250,000 print project. Pretty nice work, don't you think? I looked at it and handed it back. They spelled construction wrong. Yes, bigger than life, it was spelled construction on the cover. The poor guy visibly sagged. I'm going to have to call the client about this, you know. I can only imagine the art director on the receiving end of that phone call. I'm not sure if I wouldn't have just quietly put all my personal items in a box and left right then. Answer: but wouldn't this be the problem of the clients if they sent the final print files? I worked for a giant corporation that sent packaging files to print weekly. Any spelling mistakes were our fault, not the printers. They certainly had things they had to verify before print, including legal copy, etc. But any other actual copy mistakes were all on the graphic designer and copywriter. Story 46. A major fishing company I was working with had a ship, imagine one of the ships from Deadliest Catch but a bit bigger, in dry dock. The day before they left dry dock, they discovered that an entire deck was so corroded that about 50 of the steel had completely rusted away, which is not something you can just ignore. Had they done their due diligence, they could have identified and fixed this issue before leaving dry dock. But they didn't. So now, not only did they have to replace millions of dollars of steel while the vessel was in the water, which is at least twice as expensive as repairs in dry dock, they also now had to miss the entire fishing season, which means tens or hundreds of millions in lost revenue. I know of several people who lost jobs from this debacle. Remember, kids, if you don't schedule time for maintenance, your equipment will schedule it for you. Story 47. Worked at an ad agency. One of our clients was a beverage brand. They had a hard seltzer in the works way before White Claw, 0 calories, flavors, all of it. We had packaging designed, flavor testing done, and advertising ready to go. Someone up here thought it would cannibalize their sales, so they eliminated it. Now the company is barely holding on and has been sold a few times. Pretty solid mistake in the 100s of millions, probably billions range. Story 48. A bit over $1 billion. Yes, with a B. This one is going to ruffle some feathers because it's a health insurance company. So forgive me for being vague. Normally, when health insurance companies decide to cover a substances, they limit the approval of paying for it to a certain set of diagnoses. Sometimes they will include off-label diagnoses, but it's still a list of covered reasons. Like they're not going to pay for a prescription for a substances for eczema because you broke your toe. Well, around the time certain very expensive weight loss substances were taking off, the decision was made to blanket cover them. Most other companies limited coverage to things like diabetes and other medical reasons to lose weight. Their logic, however, was that people losing weight would overall lower healthcare costs for their members. Very logical, if you stop thinking at that point. However, it was quickly realized by the members that they could just get their or any doc to write a script for it without it being actually medically necessary. Want to drop 5 pounds before beach weather? Just go get a doc to prescribe it. Without going into detail of how I know, the vast majority of these prescriptions covered weren't going to people that needed to lose weight, populations of patients with high obesity numbers. A very large percent of them were going to suburban women in generally wealthier zip codes. No surprises there since they generally had the money to cover the deductibles and out-of-pocket maxes. So yeah, over $1 billion out the door because nobody could foresee this scenario. The best part was that, even though most health insurance companies had limited what they would cover it for, when this company decided to rein in the crazy costs and only cover it for actual medical reasons, and still generously by insurance standards in the US, it blew up online with people getting upset that the weight loss substances they wanted wouldn't be covered anymore. Answer: these substances in particular would be one of the rare times where I'm not getting my pitchforks out about an insurance company's decision. They show huge potential for increasing population-level health, but they're also still super expensive because they're all brand new, fully patent protected, which makes sense since they cost a ton of money to develop and strongly supply limited. A sane way to deal with this situation would be some kind of governmental partnership negotiation to subsidize the X of the cost for Y years, which would also give companies a stable environment around which to plan for manufacturing expansion. And of course, those negotiations would be easier if the government represented a huge base of healthcare customers directly, so the savings in overall healthcare spending could directly offset the cost of those subsidies. Story 49. Pharmacy software glitch preventing billing of partial units. But rather than round, it just removed anything after the decimal, so effectively just rounding down. This only affected billing, not inventory, so it wasn't caught at store inventories. And because most of these sites valued inventory at full price, but received pricing discounts on the back end, claims losses didn't immediately alert operations. And also, claim by claim, this wasn't massive numbers. Maybe pharmacies dispense 4.2 ml and only 4 ml billed. But over time and with many locations, the loss by the time it was caught was over 25 millers. Third-party contracts usually only allow a claim to be rebilled up to 90 days, if that, so the company couldn't recoup more than 20 of it. Story 50. Someone at my previous job had a client call in to purchase Berkshire Hathaway shares. They wanted Class B shares and asked for 100 shares to be purchased. The rep bought Class A shares, which were a few $100,000 apiece. Overspent the account. The firm had to cancel the trade and eat the difference. They walked the rep out moments after the trade error. Story 51. I watched a $500,000 worth of specialized steel alloy, 6-inch thick, get cut a 1/4 inch to small in each direction. An offset in the G-code, but since it wasn't my area, they ignored me when I pointed it out. Now, anytime they pull the "that's not your area" card, I remind them LOL. Story 52. Back when it was the Inland Revenue, U.S. readers, think IRS, the powers that be decided that they could save money on workstation costs by making every app accessible via a web interface. That way, it didn't matter what the user's workstation was. As long as it had a browser, the user would have access to the systems they needed to do their work. So a massive project was spun up to convert apps, including the old mainframe core tax systems, to a web interface. 40 million later, they find that no consideration has been given to security, and by crafting the URL, any user can access any system whether they are authorized or not. So the whole project was scrapped more or less overnight. Story 53. I've seen a startup effectively cancel a product, fire all the staff, replaced with a minimal offshore support team. That makes $100 a year because they wanted to push all the customers onto a new and improved iteration of the application. Something about using AI. The numbers just spiraled downwards after that. Who flushes $100 a year down the drain? It boggles my mind. Story 54. Gateway. They increased the size of their shipping boxes a bit here and there, but didn't tell UPS or renegotiate. I was the auditor UPS sent to investigate. The shipping increase was later found in one of my textbooks as the reason for their sudden downfall. Edit: I should have been clearer on this. The increase in size put the boxes into the oversized category, which greatly increased freight costs. The textbook reference I later saw simply indicated increased shipping costs as the issue. There's a big increase when you get into the oversized category, at least there was back then. This would have been around 2000 in VA. Story 55. 2 examples come to mind from my former company, Telco. They outsourced part of customer services to a company in Manila where they could get 5 bodies for the price of 1 here. KPIs were set up on calls answered in X seconds instead of calls resolved. Manila met their KPIs but created so much work by sheer indifference, ineptitude, and pissed off so many customers that a large team had to be assembled to sort out the messes caused by the Manila staff. But the biggie was some newfangled concept between our company and a large cell company that was very hush-hush. The potential earnings would be enormous. Contracts and agreements were signed, test area was decided, property was leased, equipment was ordered, techs were trained. The construction was well underway when the cell company realized that they were getting the raw end of the deal, and the concept would seriously dig into their bottom line if rolled out nationwide. So they had teams of lawyers pouring through the contracts and agreements looking for an out. And they found it. One of the contracts was missing a signature from one of our execs. On that basis, they withdrew from the whole project, and we could not proceed without their input. Our company tore up over $60 million over one missing signature. Story 56. I was at a conference for the marketing industry. It was mostly 20-something single women and a handful of middle-aged director-level dudes. I mention this because I assume it's the reason for what happened next. When the open bar part of the after-party ended, one of the middle-aged directors did not want the party to end and threw down his corporate card to keep the drinks rolling. He also kept asking the young people for shot suggestions and would buy them in batches of 10-20 to hand out to everyone. What's worse is the party was in a public bar, and we're pretty sure people who weren't at the conference were sneaking into our section to order drinks. It was one of the best work parties I've ever been to. I was the only one from my company there. Haha. Director dude was the life of the party and absolutely having the time of his life. But the look on his face when the bartender handed him a folded receipt that was easily 5 inches thick was haunting. It was a very good life lesson for the rest of us. I can't even imagine the conversation he and his accounting team had on Monday. That's it for this video. Don't forget to support Vancher and my second channel, Vanchus. See you soon.